Hey everyone, and welcome back to the COVID lectures on YouTube. Today we are covering Hinduism, the second part. So we're going to be here for a little while. It's probably going to take the full hour 15 to an hour and a half to go through this, but we'll see. Let's see here. Last time we were talking, we left off talking a little bit about karma, dharma, samsara, and caste. So remember karma, and most of you know this, even if you grew up in a very typically stereotypical Western European context of, being Christian and in a Christian community and stuff in America, karma. What goes around comes around, right? But karma is not as simple as that. It's because it's not limited by the same ideas of morality and ethics that we tend to apply to it, right? Your karma and whether or not you incur good karma is really determined by your dharma, and that is determined by your caste, right? So dharma is doing the thing that you're supposed to do. But what are you supposed to do depends on your caste and whether or not you are ritually pure and how pure you are and how you maintain that or help others to maintain that. And until you have worked off all of your karma and you have figured out that, everything is an illusion and whatnot, you are stuck here with the rest of us on the wheel of samsara, that is the wheel of redying. We tend to think of it, we call it reincarnation, and we tend to think of it as living over and over again, but really within the Hindu system, within the classical Hindu system, it's really put in terms of dying over and over again because their view of the world and life tends to be very dark and very pessimistic. That's the word I'm looking for. So we went through this. We talked about the four castes. We talked about how they're kind of scaled based on ritual purity. And at the very bottom, almost outside the caste system entirely, are the untouchables or the Dalit. So we are going to move forward from there, and we are going to go into how to get the hell out of here. How do you get past the wheel of samsara? How do you get off this crazy ride? It turns out you can get off the wheel because it does suck. Nobody wants to be on the wheel. And freedom from the wheel of samsara, that goal is called moksha. And if you're a sci-fi geek like myself, you're going to recognize a lot of these words get used in science fiction because they sound very, very foreign, very exotic, that kind of a thing. So if you start learning ancient languages, ancient civilizations, you start figuring out where all those science fiction writers are getting their material. Okay, so they get out. So freedom from the wheel of samsara is moksha, so release, liberation, but it requires a huge amount of discipline and time. For the vast majority of Hindus, it is like this distant distant goal that they have way off, not even for this lifetime, really. You probably don't have time for it in this lifetime, but maybe in the next few lifetimes you can work up a good amount of karma so that you can be born into a time and a place so that you can work your way off the wheel, maybe. Most of the time people are concerned about now. And because of this wheel of samsara, there's more than enough time to deal with this, getting off the wheel. So there's ample time to do that. And right now we have to deal with now. So right now you have to deal with your obligations based on your caste and your dharma so that you can position yourself better next time around. Okay? But what about now, right? There are four goods in life. So there are four good things that you should pursue, right? So number one is your duty, and that's your dharma. The duty, the thing you're supposed to be doing. Number two is artha, and that is wealth. You should pursue wealth. You should pursue financial or material stability if you possibly can. Number 3 is kama, and that is pleasure, right? So again, I think I mentioned the Kama Sutra before. It is a sex manual for creating good karma and creating energy, which I think is really interesting. All of these things can lead to good karma. Doing your best to improve your life now to accumulate good karma is perfectly fine. Moksha is the highest good, and that's number 4. But most people kind of forsake that in lieu of the other, or in order to attain the other 3. If you want to attain moksha, you have to forsake the other 3. So if you're going to get off the wheel of samsara, you have to forsake your dharma. You have to forsake your artha, which is your wealth. So you leave behind all worldly goods, and you have to forsake kama. You give up pleasure, right? The pleasures of the body. And in order to do that, if you do that rather, and you could possibly attain moksha, okay? Generating good karma leads to rebirth and redeath, and that keeps you on the wheel. So really what you want to do is get rid of your karma altogether. All right? You want to if you're accumulating good karma, you're going to be reborn into a better spot, but you're still going to be reborn. Okay? So what are we supposed to do? Right? What are we supposed to do in this life? Rituals. Rituals are kind of the basis of Hinduism. It's very ritually centered. And remember, I said before, I noted before that when we were talking about Judaism, Hinduism, and Christianity, there was this question of works versus faith, right? And for Judaism, it's primarily on your works. You're doing the Torah, you're following the law, you're doing your best to uphold all the dietary laws, all of the purity laws, all of this stuff, right? Paul comes along in Christianity and he says, no, 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 it's all about faith. And then Martin Luther in the 1500s reasserts this doctrine that it's really primarily about faith, right? And then Islam comes behind it and says, no, 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 you have to have works, right? So this question of to what degree do you need faith versus works, and how do you balance those two things is constantly at issue in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, the Abrahamic traditions. In Hinduism, it is unapologetically about the works, all right? So rituals, men rise, the males of the house, the patriarch especially, rises before the sun, and they honor the personal deities. Then they bathe in the river, hopefully if there's a river nearby, while reciting mantras, parts of the Vedas, and possibly the Upanishads, which we'll get to later. They apply their forehead markings to show which god that they honor. They do their morning prayers, hymns, readings, etc., and that is puja. The noon rituals and evening rituals are also there, but they're a lot less complex. The primary ritual is actually in the morning, all right? There are also rituals that are focused on life milestones. And again, most traditions, most cultures, even if not specifically part of the religious tradition, most cultures are going to focus somewhat on these kind of lifetime milestones. So birth, death, marriage. There may be entrances into adulthood. For America, we have the Sweet 16 birthday party, right? If you're Mexican, you might have a quinceañera at 15, and that is originally religiously bound, but is not necessarily. It's becoming increasingly secular. So in Hinduism, they also have these, and they are very much ritually bound in the religion. So you have changes in life, and these are the samskaras. So we have rituals that happen before birth to ensure a safe, that the woman can carry the child and ensure a safe birth. The first haircut, which is also kind of a point of not a big point of ritual, but the parents often take note of first, right? And these become milestones in life: your first steps, your first word, your first haircut. Introduction into studenthood for men primarily, and then for girls into womanhood. Marriage is the biggest one, and marriages in India are huge events that take place over a number of days. And if you ever get a chance to go to a Hindu marriage ceremony, I highly recommend it. It's quite an experience. I haven't been able to do it, but I know people who have. And if you take a look on YouTube or something like that for Hindu weddings, and you'll see how big of a deal it is. And then, of course, the funeral procession. And normally they tend to cremate, and they will have huge rituals around that as well, including, if you possibly can, taking the body down to the river and immersing it in the river as kind of like a last bathing. And then they put it on the funeral pyre and burn the body to ashes. There are a huge number of feasts and festivals. Nearly any day could be holy, depending on which gods you honor or don't honor, right? So keep in mind, there are upwards of 3 million deities in India. So if you were to have a single feast day for each one of those, right, for every minute, right, you would be feasting and having festivals all day long and every day. So festivals are a big deal in India, and there are a lot of them. They take great pleasure in their festivals. Every day in India, somewhere there's a festival going on, right? Festivals integrate the community. They strengthen bonds between villagers and their god or goddess, right? So anytime you have a festival or a feast, you're increasing that, you're facilitating that relationship between you, your community, and the deity. So there's one festival called the Festival of Holi. And this is a festival that is, there's actually this type of festival happens at a lot of different places. The Festival of Holi brings on kind of a temporary chaos for a day, or I can't remember. I want to say it's several days, but I'm not 100% certain. But it's this temporary chaos where roles of caste and dharma are loosened. So you could have somebody who is from a lower caste going up to a Brahmin and berating the Brahmin, or people who are tenants, berating their landlord, things like that would normally be unthinkable any other day of the week. It's very playful, very colorful. This is the festival where we see pictures every year from like National Geographic and stuff of all the colors, right? The colored powders that get flung about. And I've got pictures here, a couple of pictures from that. It celebrates Shiva's conquering of a demon called Holika. So the festival is all about Shiva conquering this demon. They also drink water with marijuana in it, and sweet milk and honey. So you get this wonderful loosening of the cultural bonds of your role. And again, this happens in a lot of different cultures. So for example, in Judaism, you have Purim, where people come together and it's a little bit more relaxed. Typically a British tradition on Boxing Day, right? So on Boxing Day, the elites would serve the servants, right? The servants serve the elites on Christmas Day, but on Boxing Day, the roles get reversed and the servants get a day off. In ancient Rome, Saturnalia took place in December, and that would be a day when servants would be served and masters would have to do the serving. So this is a really common event in a lot of traditions because it does allow for the stringent roles that you're stuck in for the rest of the year. It allows you to kind of blow those off and relax and take a breath and and not be so uptight about it for that, hopefully. All right. Pilgrimage is also very, very important in Hinduism. India itself is holy. It's kind of like Israel or Mecca. So when you're looking at India itself, India is itself a deity. India is a goddess. All right. The Ganges River is a goddess, Ganga. Varanasi is the home of Shiva, and lots of rituals happen there. Lots of pilgrimages happen there. And for example, one of the things you might do on one of the pilgrimages, you might shave your head. And this ties into, kind of off topic, but it ties into world economics, because it turns out, and this was in a really great documentary called Good Hair, the African American community spends a lot of money on their hair, and one of the things they do is they get extensions put in, right? So they have this long, straight hair, and it turns out a lot of that hair is coming out of India, and a lot of that hair is coming out of India from pilgrimage sites where people go and shave their head, and Indian women, Indian people, kind of like Japanese, Chinese, Korean. There are certain ethnic groups that tend to have very thick, dark hair. Unfortunately, if you're English like me, you have thin, sad hair, and you have to torment it with hair color and things to make it come to life at all. But if you happen to have that dark, thick hair that grows really richly, you can sell that, right? And it turns out that a lot of people are making a lot of money selling Indian hair in the beauty markets here in America, and a little bit in Europe as well, but mostly here in America. Totally weird connection. So during these pilgrimages and during these rituals, very often people will shave their heads. They also wear special clothing, kind of like you do on the Hajj, right? You have to wear special clothing, although not the same clothing, but special in its own way. Some try to go to Varanasi, sorry. They go there to die. Because in theory, if you are there when you die, it redeems a lifetime of sin. And so very often people will go there in extreme old age when they're very, very ill. They will make this pilgrimage in order to die in that city. And it turns out there are hostels or housing places for people to stay in until they die. And it is very specifically designed and set up to care for people at the end of their life. All right. And then that way also in Varanasi, they are on the Ganges, and that means that before you die or after you die, your body can be ritually immersed in the Ganges, which is the most important river in India. People do pilgrimages just to bathe in the Ganges because it's a holy river. It's also highly polluted. Go figure. I don't know. But that way their body can be immersed in the Ganges ritually and then cremated, and that will wipe away all kinds of sins that they may have done through their lives and help their karma situation out. So all of this is karma marga, right? And this is the way of action. There are 3 trimargas, meaning that there are 3 ways to get to moksha. Okay, there are 3 ways to work your way there. The first one is the way of action. Doing rituals, going on pilgrimages, participating in feast days, right? These are all actions you can take to try to work your way towards better karma and therefore indirectly towards moksha, okay? The second one is Jnana Marga, and the third one is Bhakti Marga, and we'll kind of look at all 3 of those throughout this presentation, all right? The second way that we just mentioned is Jnana Marga. I'm really terrible at pronouncing Hindu. I apologize. But this is the way of knowledge, the way of wisdom. It's rooted in classical wisdom, and it evolves out of the Upanishads, right? And remember, the Upanishads come up around 800 to 400 BCE. This is roughly the same time that the Buddha is getting up and running around. And if you know anything about Buddhism, we're going to be hitting on a lot of points that Buddhism takes into itself as well. So you can start to see where the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is being highly, highly influenced by the Upanishads, okay? So this evolves out of the Upanishads. It's considered part of the Vedas that came much earlier. So the Upanishads get added to the Vedas as the sacred texts. But the Upanishads are kind of their own little thing within Vedanta. All right, but it's kind of the ending or the completion of the Vedas, kind of, sort of. The Upanishads are more philosophical. They have to be taught by a teacher or a guru. You can't just pick them up and read them and be enlightened. The Upanishads are evolving, or they were evolving. They didn't like get written and be done. No sacred text does that, no matter what they tell you. The Quran was written over the course of a minimum of 32 years. I would venture to say if you really got in there with some text criticism and some other tools that were evolved for the Bible, you would find out some of the Quran was written later. I would put money on it. Oh my God, the Bible was written, the Old Testament was written over the course of thousands of years. The New Testament, written over the course of at least 100 or 200 years minimum, and was still getting tweaked a little bit even after that. So the latest editions came around 400 CE. All right. So this kind of leads us to, when you start getting into this philosophical spirituality and wisdom, this leads us to a question of, are we really special as human beings, right? Or what is special about us as human beings versus everything else that's out there? Is it our soul? And is the soul part of the body? And the answer for the Upanishads is that the soul is not directly connected to the body. It is not necessarily attached to the body, right? So for the Upanishads, the Atman is soul, all right? But it's not like an individual thing. Atman is kind of everywhere. It's everything. In the Vedas, the soul is closely connected to breath, which makes perfect sense in the ancient world, right? And you don't have the same critical background that we do, where we have all kinds of understanding of how the mind connects and blah, blah, blah. For the ancient world, the breath and the blood are the essence of life, depending on the tradition. So in the Vedic world, it's all about the breath. The same was, to a great degree, the same was true in Judaism. They talked about ruach, the breath or the soul, the spirit of God, right? And it's all the same word. But in the Upanishads, that's not so much the case. So the question becomes, what is our essence? It's not the breath, but what is the Atman, right? It engages this question of the mind-body split. When you say, I am hungry, who is the I, right? The body feels hunger, but who is the I that says, I am hungry, right? Who controls our thoughts, or what controls our thoughts? Who or what is actually doing the thinking? Whatever it is cannot be sensed or quantified. And so Atman is imperceptible. It is immortal. It is beyond comprehension. Atman was never born and it never dies. It simply has always been. So this is part of that non-dualistic thinking. It's taking us out of this dualism of life and death and moving us into something different, right? It's non-linear. So there's this idea that the Atman always has been. So there's no beginning. And it's really hard sometimes for Westerners to get their mind around that, because everything has to have a beginning. It has to have an ending. There's got to be something, right? And Hinduism is perfectly comfortable in the, that squidgy place of not knowing, of not having an answer, and that's okay. All right? So what about the universe? And I love this image. This image is from the Hubble telescope. It is the deep space exposure. They basically took the Hubble one day and they pointed it into a completely black section of space with nothing in it that they could readily see. Opened up the lens and let it pull in as much light as it could over a span of time. I want to say it was several days, but I'm not sure. And this is what it came up with. And all of these dots are galaxies. So in the blackest blackness of space, there are still millions of galaxies out there. So what about the universe, right? The ultimate reality. What is the source of the universe? Brahman, which is that which makes great, right? So the Vedas, the power that was within the gods is Brahman. Now, a Brahman is someone who follows Brahma. We'll straighten this out later. So the power that's within the gods, right, is Brahman. It's the power in the sacrifice. It's the power of all powers. It's universal power, right? Brahman is beyond our senses, but it's always in and around us. So again, I'm a sci-fi nerd. So I read this and I was working with this and I'm like, but is this the Force, right? I thought the Force was Taoism. But it's also Brahman, right? It is within all. It is outside of all. So it moves without moving. It is untouched by evil, but all that is good and evil is in it. It is immanent and transcendent, so it's near and in and within, but it's also outside of us. It is non-dualistic. It contains everything. It is the source. It is the sustainer. It is the destroyer. It is the spirit that transcends all human categories. The only quality Brahman has is that it has no quality. And this goes into kind of a form of theology that negates everything. Like the only way to really describe what something is to describe what it's not. And the same thing is going to be true when we talk about Buddhism, when we talk about nirvana. Nirvana contains nothing, but it also contains everything. So it contains everything, including nothing, right? And so this, again, this non-dualistic thinking that tries to get you past what the material world is constantly trying to tell you, which is that, the light is either on or off. The drink is either, in the cup or out of the cup. There's no in between. This is going to try to move us past that and get us into a different way of thinking that is non-dualistic, non-linear, and ultimately very kind of what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of it now. Anyway, existential. There we go. Well, it's kind of getting us into these existential ideas and thoughts and questions. So the Atman and the Brahman are merged. All right. So here's the thing. In Hinduism, I can look at you and say, I am God. And that makes perfect sense. And you are God as well. All right. The soul is God. Brahman is indivisible, so it's not a part of God. Atman is not a part of God. It is also God. But we're still stuck in samsara, so we're still stuck on this wheel of dying, and under this kind of illusion that we are separate. The body is not the true soul of Atman. And Maya is our perception of plurality. It's the illusion of the many things rather than the unity of all things, including ourselves. And again, the Buddhism is going to play right into this. Buddhism talks about the illusion of individuality, talks about the skandhas, talks about all kinds of similar ideas, talking about how you as an individual are an illusion, and the fact your existence itself is an illusion. Okay? So Hinduism does this as well, and they call it Maya, and Buddhism is going to employ the same word. But knowledge is not enough, right? So you cannot go through and intellectually understand all of this and say, yes, I get it, and be enlightened. It has to be internalized. You have to live as if there is no body, right? And again, if you're seeking moksha in the way of, the way of moksha, you have to renounce the way of practice, the way of dharma, the way of knowledge. You have to live as if there is no body. And so you have to renounce all things. And then you become a sannyasa. All things of the world keep you on the wheel of samsara. Truth is only within, and the body is simply an illusion. All right? So that's fun. So speaking of the gods, and I want to get through some of the Devis and Devas, a huge amount of iconography is present in Hinduism. They love their iconography. They love their images, statues and posters and paintings and all kinds of stuff. So Brahman as a god, not as a god, but Brahman, the idea, is not really truly conceivable. Okay? The idea that God is not conceivable and I am God and so are you is in part of the Hindu system, but part of the problem is that you can't talk about the ineffable. You can't talk about the thing that can't be talked about. Right? And above all, you cannot have a relationship with it. And the fact of the matter is that we are all here. We are all embodied. So to some degree, we have all bought into the plurality of being. We have bought into our own distinctiveness, our own identity, our uniqueness and individuality as human beings. And therefore, breaking up Brahman in general into individual deities is almost a psychological necessity. And this is, again, we're going to find this to be true in every religion. Religions tend to think of the deity in anthropomorphic terms, meaning terms that have to do with human form, because it's really hard to have a relationship with and talk to and pray to something out there, right? The energy or something like that. It can be done, but for most people, it's really hard to connect to universal energy or, the numinosum or something, right? These abstract ideas. They want to connect to something that sort of looks like us or acts like us. And therefore, gods have taken on these anthropomorphic identities because we need to relate to them, or we have given God anthropomorphic identity, or we have created God, depending on your opinion of all that. I don't know. But God is typically anthropomorphic, okay? If the ultimate is ineffable, you can say nothing about it, right? There's no image of God in Judaism, for example, or Islam. And there's a really great Zen saying that says, open mouth, already a mistake. Right? The ineffable is something that you cannot speak of, you cannot picture it. It's so big that it's beyond what your brain can produce. But this leads us nowhere, like I just said. In order to contemplate the uncontemplatable, you must compromise by contemplating something. All right? Problems come when we mistake our language and images there we go. The problems come when we mistake our languages and our images as being adequate. So the images are not a problem. The problem is when we mistake the image for the deity. Reality is one and many, right? So the reality is that we are all one thing, and yet on this kind of basic level of reality that we all exist in, we are many. And you can't really escape that because by thinking about it, you're already engaging it. All right? Trust me, it makes sense. The gods are knowable. Brahman is unknowable, right? So this is kind of like this question of the knowability of God is a problem for many, many traditions, and they usually have to find a way to talk about God that we can know and pray to and loves us versus the God that is unknowable, that is ineffable, that is transcendent. In Christian philosophy, very often they talk about God, but then they talk about the Godhead, which is like the God over the God, right? The ultimate expression or ultimate being of God. In Taoism, they talk about the Tao that is true is the unnamed Tao, because the minute you put a name on it, it is not the true Tao, okay? In Hinduism, you choose the God you like and just accept the fact that it's a representation of an ultimate reality that is not completely encapsulated in that representation. All right. So we're going to look at a few of the big names in the deities. When we talk about the deities, they have lots of symbols. They have anthropomorphic figures. Sometimes they are non-anthropomorphic, for example, Ganga, the river, or India itself, Mother India. But that is not the extent of the god. It's just, where you find the sort of a divine connection to that god. But notice very often the anthropomorphic images of the gods in India are not exactly anthropomorphically, not exactly biologically correct. There you go. They may have multiple faces. They may have multiple arms, all kinds of things. Their skin may be different. So Krishna's skin is blue. Kali is dark blue or black, depending on the representation. But the images are really important because for multiple reasons. And again, we're going to find this in multiple traditions. For example, in Christianity, when people could not read, especially during the medieval period, they had the Passion of the Christ in images around the cathedral so you could see the story, right? And the same is going to be true for the images in India. For a long time, most Indians were not literate, and today illiteracy is still a problem in India. And so the images of the gods are ways for people to connect to those deities, even if they cannot read the stories. Okay, so iconography is still a huge deal in India because it connects people to their divine, chosen divine God. This is an image of Ganesha. I love Ganesh myself. This is not the greatest image of him, but I thought it was a little fun because you'll notice, I want you to take note that we have the statue, but the statue has been dressed and there's flowers all around it and there's little offerings, right? And it's been painted and he's being carried through the street. And so these gods are, they are cared for in much the same way that we would care for an important person. So these images, and it's really important because part of the ritual very often for a festival or something like that will be to create the image, give offerings to the image, clothe the image, feed the image, etc. And yet at the end of the festival, they will destroy the image because the image is not God. The god may inhabit the image so that they can participate. So the statue may be inhabited by the god during the festival, but after the festival is over, the god leaves the image and now you just have a statue or whatever it is. Okay? And there's a really big effort in India to not mistake the inhabitation of a statue by the god versus the god itself. Okay? So for correct action, puja, right? Part of the way of action before was hospitality. So you give hospitality to the gods. So there's a story that a friend of mine told me that he was in India and he saw this image, this kind of statue set up for one of the gods. And the first day he walked by it, there was nothing there. The second day he walked by it, there's offerings there, banana, fruit, flowers, things like this. The following day, it was very hot, and somebody had set up a parasol over the god so that the god would not be stuck in the sun. And that's part of puja, is hospitality for the gods, right? Bhakti is your devotion to the gods and your faith. So here, Ganesha is the son of Shiva and Parvati, and we'll talk about them later. He is one of the most worshipped gods in the pantheon. He is the remover of obstacles. He is the patron of the arts and the sciences and scribes, one of the reasons I love him. He is the patron god of intellect and wisdom and beginnings. So that, for obvious reasons, well, okay, in my mind, for obvious reasons, makes him a very amenable god. He's also very funny. He can have a temper, but he's a very affable, amicable, very likable deity. All right. He has an elephant head. The story goes that Parvati gave birth to her son, and when Shiva got home, there was this kid running around, because they're gods. It's not like it's an infant, right? The kid is born and then turns into a young man, sort of. And Shiva gets home, and there's a stranger in his house with his wife, and he tears off the head of the kid and throws it. And Parvati comes out screaming and freaking out and tells him, "This is your son. This was our son, and you've killed our son." And so Shiva takes the head of an elephant that's nearby and puts it on the kid's head, and this becomes Ganesha. Okay, Brahma. Brahma is a god. This is different from Brahman, right? These are two different things. All right, a worshiper of Brahma may be a Brahmin, but Brahma himself is a different god. It is not the ultimate reality we were talking about before. So Brahman is everything and divine power. Brahma is a god, and he is the first of the divine triad, so the three most important deities in Hinduism. He's a creator, and he is dreaming the world into existence. And notice he's asleep here on the coils of a serpent. He is not really widely worshipped in India. Other gods get a lot more worship. His wife gets a huge amount of worship. But he doesn't get a whole lot of worship, but that's okay. But he's still part of the divine triad. So he is the creator. Then we have a preserver and a destroyer. Okay. And that's going to bring us to the preserver, Vishnu. Vishnu is very, very popular, partly because Krishna, he has avatars. So these are incarnations of Vishnu, where he comes down and tries to help set things right. So he is the next one in the big three. He is the sustainer, the preserver. He incarnates to empower good and restore the Dharma. When the Dharma is in trouble, he comes down to restore it. He has incarnated 9 times and will do so again before the great destruction. Like most religions have this end of the world scenario, right? Some people believe the 9th carnation was the Buddha, incorporating Buddhism into Hinduism. His perhaps most beloved avatar, like I said, is Krishna. He's in the Mahabharata, which is the longest epic poem in the world. And within the Mahabharata, we get the Bhagavad Gita. All right. The Gita, the Bhagavad Gita, the short name is the Gita. In the Gita, Arjuna, which is one of the main characters, he is going to war, and Krishna is his chariot driver. Now, at one point, Krishna gives Arjuna a choice. He says, you can either have the largest army on the planet, or you can have me as your chariot driver, but you can only pick one of those two. Arjuna is very wise, and he chooses to have Krishna as his chariot driver, not knowing that Krishna is a god. He knows that Krishna is special, but he doesn't yet know that he is fully Vishnu, right? But he chooses Krishna as his chariot driver. And as they go to war, and the war is between two clans, and if you've read the Bhagavad Gita, because I assigned it, if you read it, you know this war, this epic battle is about to happen between two sides, and the two sides are related to each other. This is all one clan, right? And Arjuna is about to lead his army into fighting and killing cousins, teachers, uncles, right? This kind of thing. And Arjuna does not want to fight, all right? He drops his bow because he sees no point in it. What is this going to lead to? It's going to lead to death. The women are going to come on the battlefield, and they will have to mourn and clean the bodies of their husbands, their sons, their brothers, their uncles, their fathers, right? And Krishna tells him, fighting is your dharma. This is the thing you're supposed to do. You are born into a caste of warriors, and this battle has already been fated. In fact, this battle has already been fought, and the dying have already died. You just need to go through the motions to finish this off. So Krishna relays the Gita and reminds Arjuna of the Upanishads and the philosophy therein, that there is no death, that Atman is eternal. And so yes, you may kill the body of your teachers and your uncles and whatnot, but the Atman, their soul, is eternal, right? But what about karma? This question of karma, right? Killing people, generally bad karma. You cannot simply act. You have to act without the desire for outcome. Okay? The karma comes because you are attached to an outcome. And again, this rings in Buddhism as well, right? You need to act, but do not act with attachment to what happens after. If you can do this, if you can act without desire for an outcome, you will incur no karma, which is even better. Okay? Karma comes from the will and the heart. Doing action like sacrifice, right, is incurring good karma, but it's not that simple. So you have to focus your mind, your heart, and your will on, in this case, Vishnu. And this leads to a vision of Krishna as his deified self. And this is the mystical moment, right? And Arjuna is both terrified and fascinated. He is terrified, but he can't look away from the sight of Vishnu in his full deific form. Okay? Now, this is happening in a moment, kind of almost a moment between moments on the battlefield. Everything else is frozen. So not everybody sees the deified form of Krishna. Only Arjuna does. And this is where Krishna points out that fate is already written. Arjuna is simply the tool or the weapon of the god. The enemy is already dead. Krishna will defeat them. Arjuna is simply the tool of the god, right? So it is his dharma to fight this battle, but it's his higher calling to fight this battle and to fight the battle to the best of his ability without being attached to winning or losing, right? That's kind of right, trying to trying to get that in your head and get it figured out. Ugh. All right, so that's Vishnu. Vishnu has a very strong following, obviously, because he's, as the preserver of the world, Vishnu's going to get a strong following because that's where your stability is, etc. And this brings us to the third of this triad, Shiva. All right, Shiva, and practicers or Shaivites, and they practice Shaivism. He is the destroyer of the universe, right? But he's full of contradiction because in Hinduism, there's an understanding that in order to have new life, you have to destroy something to create it. So he is at once a destroyer and a creator. All right. So he brings disease and he heals it. He's an ascetic, but he's also very erotic. As the Mahayogi, he is tranquil. As an ascetic, he has his eyes half closed, right? Kind of being in the world, but not of the world. He has a trident, and that is control of mind, body, and intellect. The tamed cobra, which is sometimes around him, so you can see it in one of the images here, the cobra is around his neck, so it's tamed. And that is the triumph of the ego. All right. The top knot, and again, on the colored image, the statue of him, you can see it really clearly. He has a top knot of hair that kind of flows down, and that is where the Ganges starts. That's the origin of the Ganges, symbolically. All right. He is the lord of the dance, the Maharaja. And he is dancing to dispel ignorance of the night. It's a wild dance, but his face is calm. So again, we have this kind of contradiction. He's dancing wildly, and yet he has this kind of face in a meditative state. He has 4 arms. So he has a drum that sounds the world into existence, a flame of destruction, one hand raised, saying, "Do not fear," and the other one pointing toward his foot, which is an invitation to draw near, right? To walk towards him. With one foot, he has his foot upraised in his dance, but the other foot is planted on a demon, and that is the demon of ignorance, right? And so he is dancing for the freedom of the world. He has a ring of fire around him, and that is the fire of samsara. The ring of samsara, rather, the wheel of samsara. Sometimes he's portrayed as half woman and half lord, and that is his Shakti, his essential female counterpart. So he's kind of the androgen there, an all-encompassing nature of the divine, and reminds us of our limitations. Now, there's a really interesting part of Hinduism, whereas in Chinese, like Taoism, you have yin and yang, right? And yang is the feminine, and it's passive and dark and is not activating, right? The opposite is true in Hinduism. The gods are asleep, and it requires their Shakti, their feminine counterpart, to activate them. And then they balance that feminine half by controlling the Shakti, controlling that feminine power that activates and moves through the world. Mm-hmm. All right. Now we have the goddesses. We've got several goddesses here that are really interesting. I love the goddesses. And I want to make it really clear. The goddesses are incredibly important in Hinduism, and there's a huge amount of worship of the goddess, any number of goddesses. Hinduism, Indian culture in general, still today even, is incredibly, incredibly sexist. All right. It is getting better, but still, I think, I'm sure you've heard news stories about rape and young ladies getting attacked in the fields when they go to the bathroom, especially in the poor sections of Delhi. So we're going to talk about the goddess, and we're going to talk about how incredibly powerful the goddess is, and yet women have very, very little power in Hindu society. In fact, in the Vedas, women cannot really establish very much of their own good karma. It's very much attached to their husband. Women who are not attached to a male figure are unlucky. They are kind of drains on society. They have nothing to offer And in fact, there are whole communities of widows who have kind of been forced together because they are not accepted in their communities once their husband dies. It is their bad karma that causes a husband to die early. So I want you to kind of hold that in your head when we talk about this, because this is going to be true throughout history. There's lots of incredibly powerful goddesses throughout lots of different cultures, not the least of which, Inanna, Ishtar, Asherah, a bunch of Chinese goddesses, Japanese goddesses. There's goddesses everywhere. Even in Mormonism, right? God has a wife, but nobody talks about her. And she doesn't really get labeled a goddess because she's so special that we can't know about her. She's so venerated that we can't touch her, see her, talk about her, actively worship her, which really is just a way of removing her, right? Of acknowledging that you have to have the feminine side, but not actually showing it, right? It's a way of removing the feminine while kind of giving a token. Yeah, we have to have the feminine side to have creation, but once that happens, we can get rid of it, right? De facto. So the same is going to be true here. So and again, this is true throughout multiple cultures throughout time. All of the goddesses are some form of a greater mother goddess, a Devi. The Devi is the transpersonal Brahman, right? It's kind of like Atman, the eternal goddess. And they are more terrestrial. So goddesses tend to be more connected to the earth. So the river Ganga, or the Ganges River, Ganga, the goddess Ganga, Mother India, right? So terrestrial things tend to be goddesses, and then we also have these other Devis that are part of it. Only some of them have children. And these women are consorts, they're companions, they're wives of the gods, and in this form they are benevolent and life-giving. Their male husbands rarely appear in temples without her. But the goddesses also may appear on their own without their husbands. So again, female goddess worship is very prevalent in India, but there's an acknowledgement that the men can't do anything without the goddess. And yet within the de facto culture, women are oppressed and abused on a regular basis. All right, the independent goddesses, and we'll look at a couple of them, tend to be very violent, and they tend to be very lusty. They are kind of unrestrained, and so the goddesses that are connected to a male god are benevolent and gentle and kind, and yet the independent goddesses are violent and unrestrained is probably the best word for it. Remember, Shakti is the active principle. Yeah, there it is. The color of Shakti is red for passion and heat, but it has no form, no restraint unless it is restrained by a god. And Shiva, not the god. This is, again, we've got this wordplay that kind of goes back and forth. Shiva is passive and seen as dead without his consort. So Shiva is the masculine principle as well as being a god. But it's dead. It's asleep. It doesn't have any activity without its Shakti. Okay? And this gives rise to huge amounts of confusion, especially in the West, because these Brahma, Shiva, All right. So the first goddess is Sarasvati. She is a goddess of knowledge, music, art, wisdom, and learning. She is part of a female trinity. So just like we have the Godhead, not the Godhead, but the triad of gods, right? Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. We have a triad of goddesses. We have Sarasvati, who is the Shakti of Brahma. And then we're going to have two other goddesses that are the partners for Shiva and Vishnu, all right? So the goddess Lakshmi, she is the goddess that leads to 8 goals. She is the consort of Vishnu, as is in his godly form. Krishna and Vishnu's other avatars when he incarnates, he gets married, and there are lots of other women who are kind of seen as ideal types of women on Earth because they were married to the avatar of Vishnu. But as Vishnu, the god form, Lakshmi is his consort or his companion, his wife. She leads to she leads to your goals, right? Your goals. And there are 8 types of goals: spiritual enlightenment, food, knowledge, wealth, children, resources, patience, and success. So these are, 8 possible goals that you might have, and she is going to try to lead you to them. Then we have Parvati. Parvati is the consort of Shiva, and Shiva is never seen without her. Well, I shouldn't say never. Shiva is, in painted iconography, is rarely seen without her, and she is one of the only goddesses that is typically portrayed with her husband or consort or whatever you want to call that, her partner. So she's not really worshipped on her own. Shiva is primary here. But she is the goddess of love, beauty, marriage, children, devotion, fertility, which is really interesting because Shiva is a destroyer, right? So I find this really kind of an interesting counterbalance to who Shiva is, all right? She is the supreme mother goddess, and she is the goddess of Ganesha, like I said. She has other children, but the other children are not as interesting as Ganesha, I think. You can look them up, though. Okay. Next, on the independent goddess side, we have Kali. Kali is a terrible goddess. She is terrible as in, not terrible like bad, but terrible as in scary, frightening, inspiring terror. She is a goddess of destruction. So she shows life by feeding on death. Her cult used to have human sacrifices, but she still gets animal sacrifices in place of human sacrifices. The British were, when the British came into India, they found the human sacrifices, and they were like, no, that's not happening anymore, and they outlawed it. And so her cult went to animal sacrifice after that. She tends to be associated with outbreaks of epidemics. Some people say that she's pissed off because she's neglected. And when she does get pissed off at a community, that's when you're going to see outbreaks. She dances on Shiva to wake him up. And if you see full iconography, she's dancing, and kind of like Shiva, there's something under her feet. That is Shiva, because he is, without his Shakti, he's asleep. And so she is trying to wake him up and activate him as the destroyer and dance the dance of destruction with him, helping him destroy. All right. She dwells in the cremation grounds. So she is always there where the dead are. And she makes way, though, for creation. And again, it's this kind of understanding that you cannot have life without death. They are not two different things. They are actually the same thing. New life and death are so interconnected that you really can't talk about them as separate ideas. And that's why you get Parvati so deeply connected to Shiva. Shiva is the destroyer, and yet Parvati is the goddess of marriage and children and devotion and fertility, right? You cannot do one of these things without the other. And so there's this really interesting connection here. She is called the terrible mother. She can bring mercy, and she can end the destruction. Her devotees call her mother, and they worship at her feet, and she's kind of the incarnation of this horrific mother figure, and yet there is unconditional love from her children for her as a mother. All right? The mother is the destroyer and the creator all at one time. The second goddess I wanted to look at is Durga. Now, Durga, interesting. Remember, I think I told you guys, and if I didn't, I'm going to tell you now and remind you. Hinduism is incredibly long and complex, and I have read texts where Durga is a man, is a male deity. So don't get too married to the gender here. Typically, Durga is female, but you know. She was created by Vishnu and Shiva to defeat a demon army that the gods themselves could not defeat. She is a goddess of war. She empowers destruction to make room for creation. So again, we've got destruction and to make room for creation. And she is there to overthrow all who would disrupt the peace of the Dharma. Right? And again, Dharma very interwoven into the caste system. So this question, if you get rid of the caste system politically, where does that lead your Dharma, right? Or where does that leave Dharma? What is Dharma without the caste system? And the West has many answers for that, but we'll deal with that later. She is connected to Parvati, sometimes in mythology as Parvati's warrior form. And they say that she will return whenever the gods cannot get the job done against the demons. So I love this. She takes care of the demons that the gods cannot kill. All right, just let that sink in for a minute. And the image here, she is on top of a bull riding her lion or her tiger, and she has defeated the king of the demon army there, which is a bull, because the gods couldn't get it done. They were impotent in the face of this demon army, and she took care of it. Now that we have an idea of whom we might be devoted to, right? Bhakti Marga is the other way of the three. This is our third way, and the focus of Bhakti Marga is when you are focused on a deity or multiple deities even, but you are focusing your passion and your love for that God. That is the Bhakti Marga. So if you are, if you're devoted to Vishnu, you devote your whole life, your whole being to the worship of Vishnu. All right. So there are new parts of the canon, right? The Mahabharata with the Gita and the Ramayana. And these are all to help facilitate the Bhakti Marga. How do you devote yourself to a deity? And remember, the Gita tells Arjuna, how do you devote yourself to me? You act as my tool. And you do not worry about the outcome because that's my department, right? Outcome is my deal. You just do what I tell you to do, all right? What is done is not as important as how it is done, what your intention is, and your fidelity to the deity, right? So if you go into war with the intention of winning, that's not the Bhakti Marga. Going to war with the intention of being the tool of the deity and allowing the war to play out however the deity has deemed it or how it has decided, that's your intention, and that is where your Bhakti Marga is. Okay? All paths lead to God. And this is very different from the original Vedic idea. This is coming out of the Upanishads and the later parts of the canon. This idea that every path leads to Brahman, but different paths work for different people, and that's okay. All right? In the West, I want to say a few words about what's going on in the West with Hinduism. The West received some of Hinduism in the 19th century. We were very much isolated from it until Britain got a really good hold of it, and then those ideas started kind of migrating towards the West. But for the most part, the West didn't really care, right? It was a colonial attitude towards India. Y'all are weird, you're freaky deaky, and obviously Christianity is the best. So you just keep your thing over there, and we're going to do our thing over here, and that'll be fine. But in the 19th century, we really start pulling it in and start exploring it and seeing what they have to offer. You don't get any significant number of Hindus in the West until after World War II. So it's a very late reception. But you'll notice even in this kind of short time, in 100 years or less, that we have really kind of pulled it in. We've adopted a lot of pieces of it. So for example, karma, obviously, we've reinterpreted quite a bit of it, and it's greatly impacted religious movements of the 1970s and 80s, and possibly as far back, and easily as far back as the 60s. If you look at the 60s and the Transcendental movement, that's all being influenced by Hinduism. The Beatles getting in, going to work with the guru, obviously Hinduism. We also have, during the early 80s and into the 80s, the evolution of what was called the New Age movement. And it's kind of experiencing a revival right now. If you have friends that are buying crystals and doing transcendental meditation, that's part of the New Age movement. The idea of chakras and the Kundalini snake rising is all part of Hindu meditation practice. So there's this idea that you have chakras going from the very base in the red, and it goes up the color spectrum up to the crown chakra in indigo, right? At the very top of your head. And you're supposed to meditate to awaken the Kundalini energy, to activate those chakras and to make you more powerful and more spiritually aware. And again, this is coming out of Hinduism and going straight into American spiritual movements, right? The Kundalini is activating the female energy, right? So remember, the Shakti is the energy of divine power. And so the Kundalini meditation is a way to activate Shakti and activate your divine feminine power. Hare Krishnas are a part of this. So we get some people coming over from India to establish Western versions or Western practices of Hinduism. The Hare Krishnas were founded by, and the name is going to trip me up, I know it is, some of these names are Swami Prabhupada, Swami Prabhupada, and he's the first guy over there on the stamp. He came to the West as part of the counterculture movement, and he started kind of a new Hinduism. The second guy in his turban, is Swami Vivekananda. And he brought Vedanta and yoga to the West. So I do yoga as much as I can, right? And yoga has taken on a whole new life here, and it's kind of been removed from its spiritual practice in a lot of ways and has become more of a physical workout more than it has a religious practice. But he's at least partly greatly responsible for bringing yoga to the West, where we could do what we wanted with it, which was not really a form of Hinduism, but whatever. Let's see here. See if I can pronounce this name. I love these names. They're fun to say, and yet they're so difficult to pronounce. Paramahansa Yogananda. I love the Yogananda part. So he started the Self-Realization Fellowship. All right. And those are the Hare Krishnas. All right. And then we have Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who brought transcendental meditation. And again, these are things that other Hindus may have brought in, but these are just the big names that got caught up in Western culture. All right. So that is Hinduism. I am sure you're probably going to end up pausing this, or you have paused it to try to write some things down. So we're at probably an hour and 15. So that's good. So I hope that you write down any questions you have, write down anything you want to discuss. And we will gather together again. Today is Tuesday, so I'm going to see you this afternoon, and we will talk to each other again on Thursday, hopefully after you've seen this one. And I will talk to you guys soon. Please stay well as usual. Stay indoors. Keep yourselves isolated as much as you can. Try to have a social hour with your friends on Zoom. That's absolutely necessary to maintain psychological and emotional wellness. Get some good sleep and make sure you're eating well, okay? I will see you guys later. Have a good day.